Gemini commitment truth. Why love feels like a trap, and the new way to choose depth. Gemini, people often misunderstand you when it comes to commitment. They say you're afraid of settling down, that you get bored easily, that you run when things get serious. But none of that quite captures the truth. Because you don't fear connection. In fact, you crave it. You crave deep conversation, mental intimacy, the feeling of being truly met. What you fear is something far more subtle and far more personal. You fear disappearing. There is a quiet alarm that goes off inside you when love starts to feel permanent. Not because you don't care, but because permanence has been confused with confinement. Commitment begins to feel like a narrowing of possibility, a loss of movement, a silent demand to become one fixed version of yourself. And for someone whose identity is built on curiosity, exploration, and multiplicity, that can feel like a kind of suffocation. So you hesitate. You keep space. You keep options open, not because you don't value love, but because you value aliveness. And somewhere along the way, you learn to equate aliveness with freedom, and freedom with distance. This video is not here to convince you to commit. It is here to tell the truth about what you're actually afraid of and how depth can exist without costing you your freedom. Gate 1. Analyzing the core burden. What Gemini is truly afraid of. Gemini, your deepest fear around commitment is not being tied to one person, it is being tied to one version of yourself. Commitment feels dangerous when it seems to demand consistency in a psyche that is naturally fluid. You are many things over time: curious, reflective, playful, serious, restless, thoughtful. And you fear that commitment will freeze you in place, asking you to perform stability at the cost of authenticity. This fear did not come from nowhere. It often traces back to early experiences where expectations felt heavy or identities were assigned too quickly. You may have felt misunderstood, labeled, or emotionally responsible before you were ready. You learned that being fully seen came with pressure. That closeness meant obligation. That once you showed one side of yourself, it was expected to remain the same. So you adapted. You learned to keep parts of yourself mobile. You stayed mentally engaged but emotionally light. You connected through words rather than roots. This allowed you to feel close without feeling trapped. But it also created a core burden: the belief that commitment requires self-betrayal. When a relationship deepens, this belief activates quietly. You may feel restless without knowing why. You may start questioning the connection, focusing on flaws, imagining other possibilities. This is not because the relationship is wrong, but because your nervous system associates depth with loss of autonomy. Gemini, you are not afraid of love. You are afraid of being reduced, afraid that your complexity will not survive closeness. Afraid that once you choose, you will lose the parts of yourself that thrive on discovery and movement. And this is the truth that changes everything. Commitment only feels like a trap when you believe it demands less of you, not more. Understanding this is the first step. Not toward committing to someone else, but toward reclaiming the parts of yourself you've been protecting by staying uncommitted. Gate 2. When freedom becomes a defense. Gemini, this is the part few people ever say out loud because it sounds contradictory, even to you. The same freedom you cherish can quietly become the place where intimacy goes to die. Not because freedom is wrong, but because it is sometimes used to avoid the one thing that feels most threatening: being fully known. You tell yourself you need space. And often, you do. Space is essential for your mind, your creativity, your sense of self. But the shadow appears when space becomes an escape route rather than a conscious choice. When emotional closeness starts to ask something of you: presence, consistency, vulnerability, your instinct is to move, to shift, to reframe, to create distance that feels like autonomy but functions like protection. Here is the mirror. Part of you believes that if someone truly sees you, they will expect you to stay the same. And staying the same feels impossible. So you keep things fluid. You keep conversations stimulating but commitments undefined. You keep the relationship alive in thought, not anchored in embodiment. You may even pride yourself on being non-attached or open, but beneath that openness is a fear of being emotionally pinned down. Freedom, in this shadow form, is not about expansion. It is about control. As long as you can leave, you don't have to risk losing yourself. As long as nothing is fully defined, nothing can fully claim you. But Gemini, there is a cost to this strategy. When you stay unanchored, depth never fully arrives. You may feel connected, yet not rooted. Engaged, yet not secure. And over time, this creates a quiet loneliness, being with someone without truly being there. The shadow also shows up as overthinking commitment. You analyze what could go wrong before allowing what could grow. You question your feelings not because they are unclear, but because clarity feels final. And finality feels like a door closing on all other selves you might still become. This is not immaturity. It is a nervous system trying to stay safe. But safety without intimacy is not peace. It is avoidance wearing the mask of independence. Seeing this shadow is not about shaming yourself. It is about recognizing that freedom loses its meaning when it is used to avoid depth. True freedom includes the capacity to stay, not just the option to leave. And this realization is where transformation begins. Gate 3. Commitment as expansion, not confinement. Gemini. The turning point in your relationship with commitment is not forcing yourself to stay, it is redefining what staying actually means. The old definition equated commitment with loss. Loss of options, loss of movement, loss of identity. No wonder your system resisted it. But commitment, when chosen consciously, is not a narrowing of the self. It is a deepening of it. Alchemy begins when you realize that freedom and depth are not opposites. They are partners. Healthy commitment does not ask you to become one fixed version of yourself. It asks you to bring your evolving self into a stable container. That container is not a prison, it is a place where exploration becomes meaningful because it is shared. Movement becomes safer because there is a center to return to. Gemini, your mind thrives on dialogue. Commitment does not end dialogue, it grounds it. When you stop fearing that choosing one path erases all others, you begin to experience choice as power rather than loss. You are not giving up possibility, you are giving possibility direction. The alchemy also involves redefining loyalty. Loyalty is not staying the same forever. It is staying honest as you change. It is letting your partner witness your evolution, instead of protecting them and yourself from it. This requires courage, because it means trusting that love can hold your complexity without demanding simplification. Commitment becomes liberating when it is based on self-definition rather than self-sacrifice. When you know who you are, what you need, and how you require space, staying does not feel like disappearing. It feels like choosing to be seen. This is why depth feels different once redefined. It no longer threatens your freedom, it enhances it. Because depth offers something freedom alone cannot: continuity. Meaning. The chance to grow in relationship rather than always in motion. Gemini, you were never meant to choose between freedom and love. You were meant to learn how to let them coexist. And when you do, commitment stops feeling like a trap and starts feeling like a conscious act of expansion. Gate 4. How Gemini commits without losing freedom. Gemini, this is where the work becomes real, not philosophical, not symbolic, but lived. Commitment stops being an abstract fear and becomes a series of small, grounded choices that teach your nervous system something new. Staying does not equal losing yourself. The first practice is micro-commitment. You don't need to promise forever to be present today. Your system resists large, undefined futures, but it can tolerate now. Staying in a difficult conversation instead of mentally exiting. Choosing honesty instead of charm. Allowing one moment of emotional weight without escaping into humor, logic, or distraction. These small stays retrain your relationship with depth. The second practice is naming your need for space before you need to flee. Gemini often disappears emotionally only after pressure builds. Practical presence means speaking earlier. I need time to process. I need movement. I need space. But I'm not leaving. When space is named consciously, it stops functioning as abandonment. You remain autonomous and connected. Another key practice is choosing partners who respect movement without interpreting it as rejection. Not everyone is capable of this. And that is not your failure. Commitment only feels suffocating when you are asked to be less alive in order to be loved. The right container does not demand stillness, it offers safety to move and return. Practical presence also means staying when the urge to escape is subtle. Not when things are explosive, but when they are quiet, vulnerable, and emotionally real. The moment when nothing is wrong, yet something feels exposed. That is often when your system wants out. Instead of leaving, notice the sensation. Breathe. Stay 10 seconds longer. That pause is where freedom and depth begin to coexist. Finally, commitment without fear requires embodiment. Your mind will always find reasons to hesitate. Your body tells the truth faster. When you imagine staying, do you feel contraction or grounding? When you imagine leaving, do you feel relief or avoidance? Learning to trust these signals keeps you from overthinking your way out of intimacy. Gemini, commitment becomes possible when it is practiced as presence, not promised as permanence. Choosing depth is not losing freedom, it is defining it. Gemini, the truth about commitment is not that it limits you. It is that it asks you to choose who you are while staying. And that is far more confronting than leaving. Leaving keeps every version of you hypothetical. Staying asks you to live one truth at a time. Your fear was never love. It was erasure. The fear that depth would demand you abandon your curiosity, your multiplicity, your movement. But now you know this. Real commitment does not collapse your identity. It stabilizes it enough for it to evolve. Freedom without depth becomes restlessness. Depth without freedom becomes resentment. But when you choose both consciously, something extraordinary happens. You stop running from yourself in relationships. You stop confusing escape with independence. You stop mistaking motion for aliveness. As this message ends, don't ask yourself whether you are ready to commit. Ask something far more honest. What part of me am I protecting by staying uncommitted, and does it still need protection? Let that question sit with you. Let it guide your next moment of staying instead of leaving. If this resonated, it is because you are no longer meant to live in endless possibility. You are meant to experience meaning. And meaning requires presence. Depth is not a loss of freedom. It is the freedom to choose and remain.